today, Rishi Sunak faced the liaison committee of senior MPs for a Prime Minister's traditional end-of-year grilling to gauge his annual performance. The PM was probed on Rwanda, net zero, immigration and even NHS dentistry. But as we approach Christmas, how did he fare? Was Rishi trussed up like a turkey, or did he get away with a mere light basting? Well, I'm joined now by independent Scottish MP Angus Macneil, who represents a part of the Western Isles and who is the chair of the Energy, Security and Net Zero Select Committee, who joins me from Westminster. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, Angus. So, why don't we start with net zero? He was probed on that. In particular, was it political positioning that he decided to repeal the ban on boilers? But he was very adamant in his response, saying, my approach is pragmatic. If I'm saving families between £5,000 to £15,000 a year, I think the impact on household finances is a good thing to highlight. What's your take on how he performed today?
Well, firstly, Rishi's probably quite a boring Prime Minister in comparison to some of his predecessors, most notably Boris Johnson, of course. But even old David Cameron had a bit more spark about him than Rishi Sunak. You've kind of got to give Rishi a bit of a prod with a stick, really, to get some sort of life and reaction out of him. He will try and make a culture war out of anything, and he will try and bore you to death in the same breath as well. So he's quite an interesting Prime Minister. I've seen a few of them come, I've seen a few of them go. He's probably one of the more interesting ones.
It's interesting, Angus, he was pressed a lot on the secrecy, as it was called, around the finances, the costings of the Rwanda plan. Of course, reports running it could be as high as 290 million quid so far shovelled into this, not a single person sent to Rwanda. But he wasn't very forthcoming about any detail. Do you think that's the right thing to do?
Well, I think he's reticent on Rwanda for very good reasons. I mean, it's universally seen as a pretty daft policy, a pretty daft hill to die on for any Prime Minister. He's got himself into an awful pickle about that. He wouldn't even say if he had an airline willing to take people to Rwanda. So sketchy are the details. And you're right, it's cost a lot of tens of millions, in fact hundreds of millions of pounds. I'm sure the Rwanda government, if you like, is laughing all the way to the Leeds Building Society with the money, because they've seen the UK government coming. They know it's a political totem within the UK. It's one of those culture wars that he likes, and he's got his culture war, but he's on the wrong end of a very daft culture war with this one.
Do you think it's a culture war issue? Do you think that's a bit dismissive to call it a culture war issue? I mean, let's face it, in actual fact, in every election since 2010, people have voted to control our borders. You might not like the idea, but at least he's attempting to do what the voters said.
Well, I mean, I think if he's attempting to do anything about it, he's going very much the wrong way about it, because the numbers speak for themselves. The numbers he's projecting to put to Rwanda with this policy are very few, and indeed Rwanda could send some back. So it's really, you know, it's a very, very thin icing on the top of maybe a more substantial cake. But, you know, it's become his policy, it's become his culture war. Again, I repeat that. It's become his sort of a way to cause a fissure or a division of some sort, and he'll stick to it. But when you actually, a bit like Brexit in a way, when you drill down to the numbers, it's not very impressive.
I want to pick you up on that point again, Angus. I just think it's not particularly constructive if you dismiss things you don't particularly agree with as a culture war issue. What does that even mean? If people are voting to control our borders, which they have done, if people voted for Brexit, that's not a culture war issue. It's a democratic mandate.
Well, I mean, if you want to do something with the democratic mandate and you want to respect that vote you perceive is out there, then you do something substantial. This isn't a substantial policy as regards numbers of people. It's a substantial policy perhaps as regards tens of millions of pounds. And as a result, that's why I call it a culture war. Because, you know, if you want to do something serious, you do something serious. If you want to have something trite that catches the headlines and gets you to a political corner, as he's got himself into, you do this. His policy is silly. I think he knows it, but once he's bartered it, he's got to try and look strong, as Prime Ministers like to. But he's actually looking silly, because it's a slight touch on the issue. And I would repeat again, it's more a culture war than anything substantial. It is not going to substantially alter the fact and the issue that you've just raised there. And I think people know that when they drill down into the numbers.
OK, let's drill down into some other...
for your particular point of the argument.
Well, let's drill down into some other numbers today, if we could, and that is Scotland has announced a new tax regime today, the highest tax regime in all of the United Kingdom. The 45% tax rate will get anybody over £75,000. The current threshold is £125,000. What does that say about the economic landscape within Scotland and your attitude in particular towards welcoming people who succeed and do well in life?
Well, I think I raised this with the Prime Minister. I mean, Scotland's got a £1.5 billion deficit. The Scottish Government, I'm critical of them for doing this, they're passing on a lot of Westminster cuts. And meanwhile, of course, the Republic of Ireland has got about a €10 billion surplus. So we see one country that's left the United Kingdom in a surplus and doing very well, thank you, doing much better than the United Kingdom, incidentally. But you see Scotland that's remained in the United Kingdom, being told about the broad shoulders of the United Kingdom, not seeing any help with this £1.5 billion. And do remember, every time the UK government goes into any sort of deficit, it just borrows it. It just borrows its way out of it. In fact, the UK has borrowed its way out of trouble for 67 of the last 78 years and only ever paid back about 1.7% of what it's borrowed. So it's always a bit rich when I hear UK commentators going on about Scotland when they're not comparing apples with apples as regards the UK. The UK government is constantly borrowing and is borrowing sums far in excess of anything Scotland needs this year. However, the issue is that if Scotland needs it, Scotland can whistle. If the UK government needs it, the UK government will borrow. And all the spending in the UK is guided and pushed and steered through by what's required at Westminster and nowhere else. It's not what Wales needs, it's not what Scotland needs, it's not what Northern Ireland needs, it's what Westminster needs. And I think that's why the Union is failing, and that's why we see the Republic of Ireland, incidentally, far more successful, being independent and clear of Westminster. And I think that's an example for Scotland to follow, and I certainly hope it will. But I just wish the Scottish Government would move to that rather than carrying on implementing Westminster cuts. That's my disappointment with the government at Holyrood.
How do Westminster cuts tally with the fact that the Barnett formula gives more money per capita to Scotland than anywhere else in the UK? And that's money you get from Westminster. How can you say Scotland can go whistle when you absolutely provably, on paper, get more money than anywhere else in the UK?
No, you see, you talk about the Barnett formula, you're talking about identifiable spending. It's the non-identifiable spending is a very large part. In fact, let's give you one example. MPs' accommodation, not an insubstantial figure, spent in London. That is non-identifiable spending. So that isn't Barnettised, that money that's is spent in London. The reality is we've got to move away from this. What Scotland spends, what England spends, what Wales spends. Look at the maturity with Ireland. Ireland doesn't have anybody else giving it a formula depending on on what it's going to spend. Ireland spends its own money as Ireland sees fit. There's not a formula from Brussels or Paris or anywhere else. Ireland decides for Ireland. And it's time Scotland decided for Scotland and then get a formula handed to it from London. Those days should be past. The empire is over. And I think the time of change is probably a lot closer than many of us imagine, including those in the Scottish Government.
OK, Angus, Macneil, we'll have to leave it there. But, you know, when I was an MEP in Brussels, I asked the SNP MEPs all the time, could your country fund itself and stand on its own 2 feet? They would never take my questions, because I think we all know the answer. Thanks for joining us on the show today. Have to leave it there.